Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our discussion of the Lost Boys of Montauk by Amanda M. Fairbanks, who is joining us for the discussion. My name is Marianne Delacroce and I will be your moderator this evening. We welcome your participation and discussion. This is not intended to be a lecture. Amanda M. Fairbanks is a journalist who has worked in the editorial department of the New York Times as a reporter for HuffPost and at the East Hampton Star, where she wrote investigative stories, features, and profiles. Her writing has also appeared in the Boston Globe, Newsweek, The Atlantic, and the San Francisco Chronicle. A graduate of Smith College and a former Tech for America Corps member, she has 2 master's degrees from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and currently lives with her family in Sag Harbor. So Amanda, I'm going to turn the program over to you first, and then we'll open the discussion to questions after your reading and presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me and setting this all into motion. And thank you all for making time on your Tuesday evening in a very busy holiday season, or maybe not so busy holiday season, given COVID and all of its constraints. But thank you for making the time to be here. So I'm going to read a bit from the second chapter, and then I'm going to talk a bit and open it up for questions. It was December 24th, 1972. Mary Cavagnaro was in East Hampton at a holiday party with her mother Cletus, who was chain-smoking Salem's and already blitzed. Mary felt the room spinning on her mother's behalf. She longed to be anyplace else. "Can I use your car?" Mary asked her mother. "Go ahead," Cletus said, slurring her words. Mary drove her mother's sedan to the Shagwong Tavern. In operation since 1936, the Shagwong is an iconic wood-paneled bar in the heart of downtown Montauk. Even in the dead of winter, its red and green neon sign glows along the easternmost stretch of Montauk Highway. 3 days before, Mary had run into a man named Mike Stedman at the Shagwong. She had been wearing an A-line dark brown jumper with a turtleneck, green tights, and fry boots. It was a hippie kind of thing, Mary recalled. I looked like a pixie elf. Mike liked what he saw. He hadn't wasted any time making small talk. He walked up to Mary and told her he loved her. The daughter of an alcoholic, Mary figured it was the beer talking and headed straight for the ladies' room to collect her thoughts. She slammed the bathroom door in Mike's face. But Mary had felt it too. Their connection was undeniable. "Hi, Maz," dear Hewitt, the bartender said to Mary.
Hello, come over here.
When she walked.
I brought Marla.
I wait for a second.
Good. It's already been stuff.
We're just gonna go ahead.
Okay, got it. Gotta love Zoom. When she walked into the Shagwong Tavern around 11 o'clock on Christmas Eve, Mike Stedman is in the kitchen making avocado sandwiches. Mary froze. Mike started screaming, unable to contain his excitement. He ran over to Mary. "I knew you'd come back for me," he said. Outside, snowflakes had started to fall. "I'm in love with you," Mike said, his hazel eyes catching the light. "Come home with me." It was not unlike the first time Mike had seen the wind blown. Mike was a man of action. And Mary, he saw what he wanted, and he went after it. "It was like fireworks," Mary said. It didn't hurt that Mike was drop-dead gorgeous. His perfect hair, which effortlessly fell across half his face, was the first thing that caught her eye. Based on past experiences, Mary knew that people who will alter your destiny have a powerful way of announcing themselves. There's rarely anything subtle about their arrival. Only days prior, Mary had dropped out of college, sold all of her worldly possessions, and subjected herself to the required immunizations to make a pilgrimage to Goa, India, with an on-again, off-again boyfriend. But life, it seemed, had other plans. Standing 4 inches taller, at 5 feet 10 inches and 165 pounds, Mike carried Mary out of the Shagwong Tavern and drove her to his nearby apartment. Drunk guys hoping to get laid had told Mary they'd loved her before, but this was a wholly different attraction. Making love with Mike was unlike anything she had experienced or would experience again. The admission, all these years and 2 husbands later, made her wince, but it was true. It was the magic of being young, Mary said, when the whole world is your oyster. So I first found out about this story. We're going to go back now to the winter of 2016. And I was working at the East Hampton Star as a staff reporter. And a new fellow by the name of Biddle Duke had recently joined the staff to launch a magazine called East, which comes out in the summer. It's a quarterly magazine. And we were sort of sitting around. There was a fresh blanket of snowfall on Main Street in East Hampton, and just sort of chatting about different possible story ideas for me to work on, when he told me about this great untold story of East Hampton, of the East End, of our history. And he kept going on and on about these 4 young men who had lost their lives on a fishing boat in March of '84. But during the same conversation, he kept talking quite a bit about Mary Stedman, who is obviously the widow of the young captain and really the main living protagonist of this story, as I would come to discover. And I asked him, it was clear that this story had struck a nerve. You know, his eyes had widened and the cadence of his voice shifted. And he explained, I said, you know, why don't you want to write the story? It's clear that it struck a nerve. And he explained that, you know, an outsider really needed to come in and do the story justice, that it required a certain objectivity. And for many different reasons, he was just too personally close to some of the families involved. So at that point, he passed me along to Mary, and the timing wasn't quite right. And my husband had a bit of a midlife crisis, and we moved to Northern California for 2 years. And during my first year there, I was sort of getting settled and had started working at the Chronicle, working on freelance stories. And there was just something about this story that I couldn't quite let go of. And I got back in touch with Mary. We were planning a visit out here the following summer. And she and I sat down and spoke for many hours. And then I came out and did a reporting trip later that fall. And it was really at the lighthouse. I visited just at dusk one evening. The gates were closing. And a friend and I walked up, and I explained that I was there to do some reporting about the windblown. And I was hoping to see the Lost at Sea Memorial, which, if you haven't seen it, is located right on the lighthouse grounds. And they were asking what it was I was doing there. And when I told them about the windblown, they each recalled with exact specificity where they had been standing when they first heard the news about the vessel. And it was at that moment I realized, not only had this story and tragedy impacted obviously those who knew and loved these men, but it was very much a story that still lived in the minds and the hearts of the people who've lived here this whole time. So fast forward to, I sold the book, the proposal, and in nonfiction, you sell a proposal. Some people are fascinated by that, but it's basically just a chapter and an outline of what you intend to write about. And then over the next sort of 2.5 years, I interviewed over 100 people, dozens of whom I spoke with on multiple occasions. Mary and I spoke for dozens of hours at least. I sold the book based on what I thought was sort of the first layer of the story, which is that it was about obviously these four young men who had been lost at sea. But as I dove into the story and dove into the reporting, and it's really what I love about what I get to do with my life, is that it's the thrill of this hunt, and it's kind of the search for this unknown. So as I went along, there were these different themes that presented themselves. Obviously, I hope some of you have read it, and I don't want to do too many spoiler alerts, but fathers and sons became a very apparent through line as I got to know these men and their backstories and where they had come from. And even though there was this very interesting class dynamic aboard this boat, there was really a lot that the four of them shared in common, especially around their fathers, whether their fathers had been absent or alcoholics or distant or already dead. certainly the grief and the loss component was a huge one for me to understand as a writer, and also just to learn how to talk with people who have undergone such immense trauma. And certainly it's of endless fascination to me here locally as a writer and a journalist, but the kind of upstairs downstairs dynamic between the summer people who live here a few weeks or part of the year versus the year-round folks that call the East End and all of her seasons home. And that similar class discrepancy was also apparent aboard this vessel. And definitely the coping mechanisms that some of the survivors would wrestle with, whether that looked like drug and alcohol addiction or depression and anxiety. There was all sorts of ways in which this trauma would then ricochet through the rest of their lives. And then as I drove deeper into it, obviously I uncovered quite a few different secrets that had been hidden in these different families. And but all of them sort of loop back to the same question of paternity and what it means to be a father. And did you know who your father was? And this sort of search for identity and how it is that you sort of shape the version of who you are based on this sort of primary parental figure. But a lot of nautical stories are written by white men, typically white older men. And obviously, as a woman, I was very fascinated, more so by the survivors, and specifically the women who were left to sort of make sense of their lives in the years and the decades since this tragedy occurred. So it just became of endless fascination to me to get to know, obviously, Mary, who's the widow of the young captain, and Alice Connick, who was the mother of Dave Connick, and Maud Vigilant, who's the mother of Michael Vigilant. And I also got to know some of their girlfriends as well, including Catherine and Kim. And these became vital sources to me in terms of really, it was so interesting to get to interview many of their friends and family members. But then once I actually was able to interview, for instance, for Dave Connick, his primary, love interest, he really just sort of came to life, and who it was that I thought that he really had been. Let me just go on here for one moment. Oh, and so another theme that presented itself, and the reason that I chose to explain a little bit about myself and my backstory was not out of total narcissism, but just to actually explain how it was that an outsider rather had found herself sort of drawn into this very inside story that was shared among sort of a very close-knit community. And it's very tricky here being an outsider and writing about such instances. And it became, I actually just recently wrote an essay about this that's out now called The Great Exploiter for the Columbia Journalism Review. But it talks quite a bit about sort of what the experience was like, being an outsider, but also living here and sort of uncovering these various layers of the story. And what does it mean to tell the truth? And what does it mean to do a story justice? And how it was that I sort of wrestled with the different versions that the story would become, and the sort of response to that. And what I came to discover through this process is, obviously this is not a story where I'm an authorized biographer, and this is really just my version of what happened. And there were many things that I left out. This is sort of the PG version of honestly what happened. So believe that. In terms of the writing itself, the structure was really challenging. There were so many characters. I had never written a book before, and I just went at it in a totally obsessive way of kind of like throwing, paint at a wall and not knowing, how much paint I needed, and all of these different topics and subtopics. And so it was also tricky because I knew that the reader going into the book obviously will know that these four men don't come back, right? These four men are lost at sea. And so I wanted to be very upfront with the reader with that, while also drawing them through this kind of braided narrative where we get to know these different characters from all of these many facets of their lives. And the other piece that was so interesting was memory. And I think going into this, I had an idea that, you know, memories are these fixed things that are concrete. And actually, if I were to call each of you tomorrow morning and ask you about this evening, you know, each of you would recall different things. And if I were to call you 40 years from now and ask you about this evening, not only would you probably not remember it, unless something really dramatic were to happen shortly thereafter, but you would all recall such different things. And actually, my prompting of the question could lead you to respond in certain ways. And even the recollection of that memory has you remembering it a particular way, if that makes sense. So it became very tricky. And there were several instances within the narrative where people's memories completely did not line up. And I sort of left that to the reader to decide, you know, what it was that had actually occurred. And one of the more interesting things that's taken place in recent months, in September, actually, I took a dive trip with 3 young men who search actual shipwrecks, primarily from other centuries. But once they heard about the windblown, they were very interested to see if they could go and find it. So I went on a dive boat with these 3 gentlemen and a captain, and we went out about 90 miles from the point and turned the motor off. And they had, you know, all of their gear and their cameras and their lights. And they went down about 200 feet below the surface, where there was no ambient light and it was completely dark, pitch black. And they believe that they, on this video that they then obviously reviewed afterwards, that they were able to find both the engine, which was a similar make and model that the Windblown would have had, which is interesting, and also several pieces of white painted wood. And in addition, there was several layers of sand and sediment, but there was also sort of like a hole-shaped possible structure buried there as well. So it's just kind of interesting in terms of, obviously this has not yet been positively identified, and they're very cautious in terms of overstating that. But it was quite exciting to think that obviously there might not be closure in the grand sense of the word, but just to know the exact spot of the ocean where this vessel went down. And it was quite moving, actually, being out there, you know, waiting for them to come back up to the surface. They were down there for about 90 minutes. And to just think, you know, I had spent so many years trying to imagine what had occurred in those final minutes and seconds of their lives, and how that tragedy would then ricochet through the next generation and the generation after that. And so much of the story, so much of the sadness of the story, I think, relates to the lack of closure. And, you know, as humans, we need the body, we need the period at the end of a sentence. We need that physical proof, I think, in order to kind of move on with our lives. And that was certainly not the case for this story. And it was just so fascinating to see just the devastating consequences of that, and really the universality, I think, of that experience that many of us can relate to, that feeling of grief and loss, and trying to move on with their lives. So I've spoken quite a bit. I'd love to open it up to questions, and very grateful to be here tonight.
Thank you. I'll start, just get us started, and then, you know, folks, as you have questions, please feel free to chime in. Amanda, could you talk a little bit about your interview process with these women, and how, you know, you were able to get them to open up to you and talk about these things? You know, I imagine that has to be really hard, especially since they didn't know you and you are admittedly an outsider,
Yes.
how you
Yes,
gain
of course.
trust and, how you were able to do that.
Yeah. It's a long process getting to really know, as you know, getting to know someone. And this wasn't just sort of a simple newspaper story that I was so accustomed to writing. Mary has a photographic memory, for instance, and so we would talk for 3 to 4 hours at a time. And by the end of it, I'd be lying in my office with my tape recorder on, just kind of listening when we weren't in person. I think trust gets established over a period of time. And this was different in the sense that, unlike say when I'm working on a newspaper story, there was much more of a give and take here. There was much more, they got to know a little bit about me. I obviously got to know a whole lot about them. And I grew to care for them and to empathize with them and and that's sort of part of the messiness, I think, of that journalist source relationship. And, the women over time, would kind of reveal themselves to me. But I think at first it was quite challenging. But they all, certainly the girlfriends were quite tricky to track down. But of all of the dozens and dozens of people that I interviewed, maybe 2 people didn't want to speak with me, and many did so at such length. Alice Connick, for instance, the mother of David Connick, who has since passed away, I'll never forget. It was the day after the anniversary, and I was driving up to her house, and I knew that she wasn't particularly well, and I knew that we would only have this one opportunity together, this one morning, afternoon, whatever it was, however many hours I was going to be there. And I was just so moved by her and how lucid her mind was. And I felt so fortunate that I was able to connect with her and to reach her before she would pass away and all of that history and that story would be lost. And so that was very, very moving and touching and honestly quite heartbreaking and difficult. A lot of these conversations were not just with the women, with a lot of their friends. Some of them hadn't spoken about it, besides, or for decades really. And there was still a lot of grief and sadness. And it was a lot of really heavy conversations over and over again, honestly, which was difficult. Yeah.
So, yeah. Does anybody have any questions or any topics that they'd like to talk about? I have a whole page of questions, so I can go on and on. But
Marian's gonna be here all night.
Yeah, I do have a question with this investigation. Is it ongoing to find the remains, or is it kind of like in the background and nobody's really pursuing, to find the actual ship?
So I think the remains of the men are very doubtful.
Right.
I'm not a scientist, but yes, I mean, so there's this sort of shipwreck, finding group that are quite active online, and the Windblown is one of those wrecks. Has yet to be identified. And so I don't know that I wouldn't characterize it as, lots of people clamoring to go look for this.
Right. It's a local type of.
A local, yes, a local
Right.
subset, a local, it's certainly a spot of interest. I think for some people, it's a little puzzling that it hasn't been identified, given that it's, so rather, relatively very close to the point.
Right.
It's not halfway to England or what have you.
Right.
So yeah, I think among us, the fleet of fishermen, some of them certainly, it would be nice to know where that spot is.
I was fascinated by, as I said, I went to school with the Stedmans. I related to East Williston. I grew up there. The streets that you named is such a small town and so unheard of when you say Wheatley and, just, I told some of I keep in touch with several of my classmates and mentioned the book. and mention the Stedmans. As I said, I was friendly. I wasn't friends with John, who I read in the book, is no
Yeah.
longer, he
Yeah,
had
no longer
passed
alive at
away.
Right,
And
right.
the Geary, there's a Geary that I went to school with who was the surfer. Now I went to graduated with a Gibb Geary, but there was, I think, Scott Geary that was
Yes,
mentioned.
that was actually my second interview for this whole book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So he's still around.
He is
Okay,
still around.
they're younger than I was. They were a few years younger. But I
Okay.
had to look back in my yearbook because, you know, it's been so many years that I knew the names, but because it was a very small school, and I just, you know, was fascinated in particular with the Mary and the, you know, Michael, you know, story.
Yes, yes. I continue to be.
I thought at first she was reluctant to talk to you. Did I read that into, you know,
She was, yeah, the
yeah.
time, that initial summer that, you know, the timing wasn't right. And then I was moving away, and then we wouldn't really connect until sort of the following year.
Oh, okay. That's what yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. But
Yeah.
you don't keep in touch with her now.
I am not in touch with Marion now. No, we became quite estranged once, you know, the different secrets in the book came.
Well,
to
the
light.
reveal, I was shocked with the reveal that one of the children, yeah, I
I
know.
know. Difficult.
So
It's a
can I
difficult
ask you,
situation.
Yeah, sorry.
can
Go
I ask
ahead,
you a
Barbara.
question about that? Thank
Yes.
you. I actually wanted to ask you, I hope you can still hear me. It seems like my AirPods are about to die. I wanted to ask you about that exact issue. It seems that you were very sort of careful, but candid about the way you portrayed a lot of these people. And some of them were very clearly ended up not being very happy about the way they were portrayed or secrets that were
Right.
revealed. Can you talk about that?
About what about that specifically?
Well, just what was your thought process about that, and
Oh, yes.
how it sort of came out to that you thought it was important, and how you chose to portray various
I
of
chose
those
to portray
events.
them. Right.
I also just want to say, I don't think you should worry about spoiler alerts, because I thought that
Because
the
I've all
book
read it?
really handled
Okay.
them beautifully.
Okay, got it. So, you know, I didn't go into the story knowing any of those secrets, right? That this wasn't known to me until I was a year and a half into the story. And, you know, it was quite tricky because Mary had sort of drawn me, you know, I had pulled me in very close, while also kind of leaving out, you know, a pretty major part of her story, right? And so once it was the case that I found out about it through these other sources, including her son, and then I looped back around with her to corroborate stories and say, hey, you know, I think you might have left some stuff out. She, you know, she explained why she made the decisions that she made, and then, you know, became really upset by the fact that this may or may not go into the book. And for a long time, I really wrestled with, you know, what to put in and what not to put in. I think some people, I did a bunch of events over the summer, and two of the questions, you know, were sort of along the lines of, was this too much information to share? These are private lives. And, you know, these were all willing participants in my book. They all wanted to talk to me and tell their story. And, you know, I personally think that the story, you know, obviously I wrote the book I wrote, and for a long time, as I explained, I did wrestle with what to put in and what to leave out. But, you know, I think that the fullness of a story and the truth of the story, and the fact that, you know, one of the main themes has to do with fathers and sons. So the fact that these revelations that occur later on have to do with those very same things felt to me really relevant to the whole story. And also the piece of grief, which is that, you know, especially around those secrets for the survivors, it was so tricky because it wasn't just the tragedy that had affected them, but that it then got lumped in with all this other stuff the men never had to deal with in 84, right? But it was the life that continued being lived afterward that the survivors had to grapple with and make sense of. And the two were inextricably linked for them, at least. And so that was part of the thinking there. And also I had a very fortuitous meeting with one of the girlfriends of the sons shortly before I was deciding the exactly what to include and what to leave out. And, you know, she sort of leveled with me and said that for a group of folks that were growing up here in East Hampton, this was not a state secret. This was a known thing. It's a small town, word traveled, and that if I weren't to include it, people would read it among this little universe of people, and they would think I didn't know what I was talking about, that I had spent all these years writing the story and I never even got the whole story. And so for all of those reasons, I decided to include it. And of course, not everyone is happy about that. And, you know, this, I think, again, the insider outsider part, the fact that I'm a woman, the fact that, you know, I don't know, it's been sort of this soupy mess of where people have come out in terms of the reaction to it, if that makes sense.
Well, I
Say
think you did a
Levy.
great job. And I thought the book was terrific. And
thank you.
I'd really like to hear what the non-PG version was.
That will never leave my computer.
Fair enough.
A lot of things were shared off the record.
Well, I
which
just want to
people
say thank
never-
you. It was a really great book.
Oh, thank you so much.
I agree. Yeah, it was
Thank you.
great. Mhm.
Thank you guys. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I thought it was a great book. I have to say, when it was announced that this was going to be the topic this month and just mentioned the title, and I wasn't aware of it until it was mentioned, I thought, frankly, it was going to be a fiction. It was going to be a novel, just
Mhm.
based on the title. And as soon as I did a little bit of research on it, it's like, oh, I better check this out. Looks like it's going to be interesting. And then I signed up to see the Zoom here. I'm very glad I did. So by the time I got through my second reading, mine looks like it sprouted fireweed throughout the whole book from sticky notes. And
I love it.
Yeah, I loved it too. And I won't touch on everything, but one I'll mention that probably I may be the only person that it jumped out at, but it really did. And it was Dennis Mahoney's story.
Oh, yes, yes.
And you're mentioning him as a World War II vet with PTSD that at the time wasn't known. And the reason that really hit me is I happen to be a Vietnam vet, but I was a Boy Scout and played taps at a bunch of World War II veterans funerals back in the 50s. And one person who I did not, but who I knew was known by his peers, be my parents and their generation, as having an alcohol problem, a drinking problem.
Mhm.
And he suffered that reputation throughout all the time that I knew of him. Some of his kids were peers of mine. And it wasn't until PTSD became known that I said, that's exactly what he was going through, because he had gone in as a private and he came out as a captain of an infantry company. All of those promotions had to have happened because of experience, what he had shown on the battlefield.
Mhm.
And to go through that progression, you just knew that he had stuff that he was never going to shake.
Mhm.
And the bottle was never going to shake it for him either.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Of course, of course. I could have spent, a whole book really at Mahoneyville.
I
And
bet.
that family and going back, there were actually lots of things that were not put in the book, but some of them were actually the young women's experience of being at Mahoneyville and how it was so male dominated. And, many of them had to get abortions as a consequence and didn't actually have very fond recollections of it. And it felt quite dangerous and out of control. And But no, the whole Mahoney family and that whole space of, and the work then that Dennis went on to do as a therapist, I thought was quite moving, given all that his father
Yeah.
had experienced. But thank you for sharing that. That's very moving.
Amanda,
I got others too, unless someone
Oh
else
yeah, of
jumps in.
course, of course.
I was gonna say, can you touch on maybe, like, we've been talking a little bit about folks' reactions, and you talked briefly about, in the book, it's the north side of the highway and the south side of the highway and different classes and stuff. Do you think that different classes in East Hampton have had different reactions to the story?
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a great question.
Or reaction to your book? I mean, not the story in general, to your writing.
Different classes, yeah. Well, I have yet to get a speaking invitation from the Maidstone Club. And I'm not going to wait for that. Although they were actually very nice to me at Authors Night. And I spoke at another private club where there's many sort of cross-pollinating of members. And they were very gracious and kind. But, I definitely think among sort of the Montauk sort of working class, I don't know that there's such a fan. The fact that I'm an outsider, the fact that, this is their story, how dare someone else come along and try and tell it? I was sort of damned from the outset, but honestly, I try, I get so many lovely notes from people all over the country that the book has really resonated with, that I try and dwell on that as much as I can, to be totally honest.
Okay.
I'm never going to shake the phrase all size zero when I do the Maidstone Club introduction to the women.
Drinking their tab soda, I know.
Yes.
No, exactly.
A question for people who've read the book. I wonder why you decided to read the book. For me, everyone was coming up to me asking me if I had read it. I think over the summer, and I was like, no, but I think I have to, and so I wonder how people heard of it, or why you decided to read it. I'm curious to hear that.
Well, I read it because of the local, the people that I knew. I read some like publications in, the free magazines that you get, and then just in Newsday. I think I read the review, and I'm not a reader. I have coworkers that read a book a week, and I kind of got, I must read this, and I was happy I did. And they said, what have you read since? I go, I haven't. I have to confess that, I really wanted to after I finished that book, but it was captivating. I finished it in as a non-reader in about 2 or 3 days. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, really enjoyed it. Yeah, and recommended it to several other people. Yeah.
Thank you, Carol. I don't see you, Carol, but I'm thanking you.
I don't know how to do that. I'm sure it's just as well. I'm not very savvy with, No, my husband has offered to put my picture up. It's okay. No,
Okay, got it.
he's
Oh, it
doing
says here,
that.
he's still.
Oh, okay. There we go. Okay, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Hello.
Yeah.
Oh, and look at you. You have boats in the background. How cool.
Why do I have boats?
Put boats.
Oh, it's
Put
my
boats in
husband's
Sebastian.
house. Okay, got
I
it.
love that. Okay, very cool.
Okay, very appropriate.
Very
Okay.
appropriate.
Yeah, a boat scene for the book. Okay.
Victoria, you have your hand raised. Is there something that you wanted to say also?
Yes, sure. Hi, my name is Vicky, and Amanda, I first heard about your book at the East Hampton Library, and you did a talk during the winter. And of course, I was very moved and instantly had to put my name on to be able to read the book. Well, I read your book in a day and was hysterical, crying at
Oh,
the beach because I was so moved. And spoiler alert, I don't want to give it away, but especially the ending. The
mm,
Yeah.
ending just totally,
Yep.
eh, eh, priceless. That's all I can say. Your writing is unbelievable.
Oh, thank
The
you.
prose, I mean, definitely could tell you went to Columbia. I'm definite. And then I was so impressed the way you brought in so much of the local history, the facts. I mean, the local community, the people, LVIS, Olivia Brooks, the trees. I mean, the tree in front of Most Holy Trinity, John Marshall. I mean, there was so much of the detail that went into it that is so East Hampton. You were right on target. And
Oh, thank you.
I was just so impressed by your writing. And I do know that you spoke at the Devon. And I do know that everyone had been talking about your book. I was talking about your book at the library, at LVIS, at ABA, and everyone. The buzz was going around, and people were totally involved with the book. And yes, on both sides.
Oh,
But
yeah, right,
it,
right.
it was just a wonderful piece of writing, and I just can't wait to read your next book. And
Oh,
thank
that's so
you.
kind of you, Victoria. Thank you so much for that praise. It means a lot. And I'll just say one thing about the ending. You know, I was going on and on and on, and it was going to end badly and, you know, and tragically, because it is a very sad story. And it really wasn't until Chris and I, over the period of years, really got to know one another. And I shared with him things that were happening in my life, and he shared with the things that are happening in his life. And he really brought me in and, you know, brought me along on what it meant to put his life back together. And as soon as he shared with me that story, I just, you know, I was in tears, and I felt like that was the place where I wanted to leave the reader, which is a feeling of hopefulness that after this long, dark story, there is this shred of light and optimism. Not to say that they're, you know, have completely repaired their relationship, but that is still possible. So thank you for that, Victoria. I appreciate your assessment from the ground. Yes, I see your hand, Stephen.
Yeah. My like I say, once I realized it was a real story, because of my wife Carol's connections to East Hampton, because her grandmother went there to teach in 1901, and then her great uncle Judd Bannister ended up becoming both a fire chief and ultimately the village mayor for 18 years, from 1936 to 1954. I got interested in sort of his and the family story, and so we've been going back for years now, and for most of them we end up staying out in Nepig at Windward Shores. So
oh, nice.
when we decide to eat in Montauk, it's usually the Shagwan, and in East Hampton it's always John Pappas. And so
very nice.
The fascination to me, and the reason, you know, I've bought all books sort of from that area, and fondly go back to Everett Rattray's The South Fork from time to time, but just look for, in your case, it wasn't so much people that I knew, a few names that I recognize or had interactions in, but all kinds of places, and occasionally situations. And like you mentioned, the fundraiser that was held at the Laundry Restaurant. Well, that building was actually built by Judd Bannister. It was his, actually at that point, it was his third laundry that he had built, because two others that he had been involved in, including the first one on Race Lane, had burned. And that's when he decided to build with brick.
Oh, wow. Wow, interesting. Love that.
Do you think that the town can do more to commemorate lives that are lost at sea?
That's an interesting question. I mean, before the Lost at Sea Memorial, there wasn't anything, right?
Yeah.
And that's for all of Long Island.
Not true.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it would have to depend maybe on individual family members, but there is something so moving if you are ever across the street from Most Holy Trinity and you see the plaques that are in the ground. There's, there's for different people. One is obviously for Michael Stedman, or maybe a bench of some kind, or something where you don't have to maybe necessarily go all the way to the end of the point to commemorate them, is something to think about. Yeah, since it's so much a part of the history. If you go look at that plaque, you see these names from so many centuries and so much of our history here, which is quite moving to think about. So
Go ahead,
definitely
Candace.
something to
Yeah.
consider. Yes, Candace.
Hi, just a quick comment. There is the Broken Mast Memorial in the cemetery in Sag Harbor, in the
Oh,
Oakland
right.
Cemetery, which is, I think it's magnificent, and the cemetery is magnificent, but I just think that is such an awesome thing, and maybe something like that could be done again.
That's such a good point, Candace. Thank you. I completely forgot about that.
And
Thank you.
Michael, I see you have your hand. Yes. Oops.
Thank you very much. This is I'm so enjoying this. Amanda, congratulations on your book. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you.
I so enjoyed it. I've been going to the Hamptons since I was a little kid. I'm in my 50s. We have a house in Sag Harbor. My wife actually ran into you at Serene Green and you had a hat on. And my wife said, oh,
Yes.
my husband's reading that book. And you said, oh, I wrote that book. That was very
so
fun.
funny.
But I really thought the book was so interesting about the whole surfing culture that's going on out there. I had no context for why that is. I love learning about fishing and fishermen, and my mom passed away when I was a kid. So I could really feel for the children and kind of what it was like to lose a parent when you were a kid. And I loved all the history and the stuff of the Maidstone, and it was very interesting to just read about how messy people's lives are. And I was wondering, but it made for such a rich story. But I was wondering, did you have any idea about all that, or you just kind of discovered it all during your process?
I had no idea going into it, to be totally honest, how many layers there were, beneath this. Like, I thought it was just sort of a pretty straightforward story, and no, I didn't. But I think that I think a lot of our lives are way more complicated than the version at first we like to present, which doesn't necessarily mean we need to always present that version to the world. But I don't love going to cocktail parties and making like endless, obviously we're not even at cocktail parties anymore, but one of the parts of COVID that I've loved not having to deal with is like going to a cocktail party and just saying hello to everyone, and then not really having like I'd so much rather be at a dinner with one or two people and get into like what's actually happening versus like the surface layer of what's happening. So no, I didn't know that going in, but it became so interesting to just think, about these families and how complicated and layered they are, and not just the father issues, but all of them had lots of mother issues as well. And sort of, Dave Connick for sure had a very difficult relationship with Alice, his mother. And that was another reason he was out on that damn boat, searching for himself. So yeah, but no, I didn't know that going into it. So it did make for an more interesting story, I do believe. Yeah.
I was also reading Bruce Springsteen's biography.
Oh, wow, I haven't read that yet.
Same time, and I just kind of came away with the thought that the things that happen to us our first 18 years of our lives, depending on how that goes for you, we spend the rest of our lives trying to reconcile and make peace with. I mean, for me, it was my mom passing away. So I just, life is tenuous. You know what I mean? So, but anyway, that's just something that occurred.
I also underwent a pretty significant childhood trauma, and I think that shaped obviously the person I am now, the kinds of stories I want to tell, the things I'm interested in talking about. I think that's so correct. also as a parent, you realize just how
Mhm.
all the ways in which you're screwing up your children. You don't even realize it, right? um, I have a 6 and a 9-year-old, and we're doing our best, but it's challenging. It's really, really challenging being a parent. So I also have a lot of empathy for the parents in this story that, everyone's kind of doing their best.
Yeah.
And came to this world with a certain toolkit, which they inherited from their parents, and we're all just in that mess all together. But thank you for your close read, and it's a pleasure to see you tonight.
I can't wait for your next book.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you.
What is next for you, Amanda?
So I'm not going to do another story based here for the time being, for many reasons. It just felt like a little too close to home, and for lots of reasons. But I am going to do a story. I'm just starting it. It's based in Connecticut, and it's involving a small town and groundwater contamination and a potential cancer cluster. And we're going to go out from there, and these characters that we'll get to know in Connecticut, and examine sort of the state of our groundwater throughout the country, which is not great.
Is that also nonfiction?
This is also nonfiction. Yes, I only do nonfiction. So if anyone has an amazing untold story, you know where to find me on the internet. But I wanted to, I will come back and do another story here at some point. I'm sure of it. But for this next project, I wanted a little distance between where I live and where my children go to school, and a little bit of that distance.
Whereabouts in Connecticut?
This is a town called Cheshire, Connecticut, which is about 30 miles north of New Haven. Yeah.
My nephew went to for also the University of Maine, and his first girlfriend was from there.
Well, there you have it. See, what a small
He
world.
married his second girlfriend.
Love it.
We have time for maybe one more question, if anybody has one more question they want to ask or comment.
I'd like to ask, obviously, because you didn't know some of the things going into the book, and you had a concept for what you were planning to write, how much did that change when you found out what you found out?
Oh, you mean toward the end of the book, the revelations?
Yeah.
I waited to write the book until I had finished reporting the book. So it wasn't like I had written a version and then I found out a bunch of other stuff and then I rewrote a different ending. If you know what I mean. I did rewrite it a bunch of times and I reordered it a bunch of times, but I always knew what I the knowledge base that I had going into it from the beginning. But I really did wrestle with what to put in, with what to leave out, who I owed, a certain. I mean, it's very messy, this journalist source stuff. I'll constantly be thinking about it and the work that I do. I take it very seriously when someone entrusts their life story to me, and to tell it, judiciously and truthfully. But it's not always so cut and dry. So I hope that answers your question, Karen.
That came across, it affected people's lives, but.
Yes. Indeed, it did. It definitely did. Anything else? Any other questions? A lovely group of book participants.
This was
Great.
fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you, Amanda, for joining us.
Oh, thank
you.
Yes,
If you
thank you.
haven't already picked up your own copy of The Lost Boys of Montauk, please do so and soon and read it and let us know how you loved it. And stay tuned to our website for more information about our upcoming events and programs, and consider making a donation which supports our free outreach programs such as this one. And have a wonderful evening
Thank
and
you.
a happy holiday
Okay.
season.
Can I just add one
Thank
thing
you
that
very
I-
much,
that I
Amanda.
forgot? One more thing. On CBS Saturday morning, this coming Saturday, Anthony Mason is going to be doing a segment about me in the book. So if you're
Oh,
watching,
wow, we watch that all the time. Yeah.
oh, fun.
Oh,
So
that's
if you're
great.
watching the news this weekend, that'll be on Saturday. So,
Yeah, we DVR that. Okay, that's great.
okay.
Okay,
All right.
thanks
Thank you
again,
all. Take
Amanda.
care.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Happy holidays. Thank you.
Okay,
you.
bye-bye.
Bye.